In this intense story, a successful black activist faces blatant racism when a police officer unjustly targets him during a routine traffic stop. Despite his calm demeanor and attempts to comply, the officer's prejudice and assumptions about his identity quickly escalate into a humiliating confrontation. The protagonist is subjected to microaggressions and overt acts of discrimination, revealing the systemic biases embedded within law enforcement. As the tension rises, viewers are forced to confront the painful reality of racism in America, as one man's dignity is put to the test in the face of unfair treatment. The soft buzz of morning traffic surrounded the corner cafe as Daniel Thompson, CEO of one of the fastest-growing renewable energy companies in the country, sipped his coffee in quiet solitude. His black leather jacket, the only trace of luxury in his otherwise understated outfit, blended into the background of the small, bustling diner. It was the kind of place where regulars knew each other's names, where the barista called out orders with a practiced ease, and where no one, save for the few tourists who wandered in, gave much thought to anyone else. Daniel was an unassuming figure here. His rough-hewn stubble and warm smile were the only parts of his appearance that hinted at a deeper strength, something hard-earned. Despite the success he'd built from the ground up, Daniel found peace in places like this, away from the constant buzz of boardrooms and investor meetings. Here, he wasn't just another corporate executive, he was just another man, sitting with a cup of coffee, enjoying the rhythm of a regular morning. But the contrast between his present and the rest of his life was glaring. He was the architect of a company valued in the billions, known across the globe for pioneering sustainable technology. Yet, when he stepped into this diner, no one paid him a second glance. The patrons who shuffled in and out didn't recognize him for the businessman he was. They saw only the same face they passed every morning, a face that didn't fit their mental image of a tech mogul. They assumed he was just another regular. The world outside, on the other hand, expected a different version of Daniel. They anticipated flashy suits, media appearances, and all the trappings of power. But Daniel was different. His wealth and influence hadn't changed his identity. He'd grown up on the streets of South Chicago, a place where survival meant adaptability, and humility was as essential as grit. From the moment he'd begun to taste success, he'd made a conscious choice not to wear it on his sleeve. Today, as he sat in the corner booth with a newspaper spread out before him, his navy blue hoodie and jeans were perfectly in sync with the coffee stains on the table, the mismatched mugs, and the chipped tiles on the floor. The waitress, a woman in her 40s with a no-nonsense attitude, smiled at him as she refilled his cup. She didn't know who he was, and it didn't matter. Daniel appreciated that anonymity. It allowed him to enjoy a quiet morning, as ordinary as any other, without the weight of expectations bearing down on him. "Thanks, Rachel," Daniel said, catching her gaze for a moment. She grinned, pushing a stray lock of hair from her face. "No problem, hun. You're here early today. Got that big board meeting?" Daniel smiled faintly, folding the paper as he set it aside. "Just a usual day," he said, his voice smooth, with none of the usual corporate polish. Rachel didn't need to know that his company was working on a deal with the government to expand its energy infrastructure. She didn't need to know that he was about to meet with international investors who would be depending on him to push a project forward that would change the world. She knew him as a regular, and for Daniel, that was enough. A few minutes later, the door chimed with the entrance of a new customer, a man in his 50s, with a noticeable scowl, a slightly rumpled business suit, and the kind of demeanor that screamed impatience. The man scanned the room and, with a swift glance, chose the seat opposite Daniel's, not realizing how closely he was about to sit to someone who might as well have been a stranger in his world. The man sat down without a word, his eyes lingering on Daniel for a fraction of a second before he turned his gaze to the menu, his impatience barely hidden. Rachel was already halfway across the room, delivering a fresh pot of coffee to another table, when the man at the next booth cleared his throat loudly. "Excuse me?" he said, snapping his fingers. "Can I get some attention here? I've been waiting." Daniel felt his chest tighten, but he remained still, allowing the tension to build. A few seconds passed before Rachel walked over, her calm demeanor never wavering. "What can I get you, sir?" she asked, the words flat but polite. "I've been sitting here forever. You could at least bring the menu faster." His words dripped with a sense of entitlement, a thinly veiled arrogance that rubbed against Daniel's own sense of justice. He watched Rachel stiffen, but her voice stayed steady. "I'm sorry, sir. I'm helping another customer right now. I'll be with you in just a moment." "Unbelievable," the man muttered under his breath, but Daniel caught the sharp edge of disdain in his tone. The kind of disdain that felt familiar to Daniel, like the assumption that people who served, people who didn't fit, were meant to be treated as less than. The man's words hovered between them, thick with a casual prejudice that Daniel had learned to ignore. Still, it stung. His eyes flicked to the window, where the world outside seemed so far removed from the tense atmosphere inside the diner. He wasn't sure how long he could continue to be the observer. The wait was excruciating. When Rachel returned to take the man's order, she smiled as if nothing had happened. "What can I get you, sir?" Daniel watched the man look at Rachel with an expression that was almost dismissive. "Just bring me a coffee, and make sure it's strong this time." Rachel nodded, the kindness in her voice softening the sharpness of his request. As the minutes passed, Daniel's patience began to wear thin. It wasn't the man's attitude that bothered him. It was the silent way in which the world often ignored people like Rachel, the ones who kept things running in the background, while people like him were expected to live at the forefront, as if they belonged there. The world had a habit of elevating people like him only when it suited them, when it could be seen, but when it didn't, when he sat in places like this, the expectations vanished. And worse, they weren't the only ones. Daniel had seen it before, countless times. The world loved to assume that people like him, the ones who built their empires, were just lucky. It rarely cared to acknowledge the struggles. His fingers drummed lightly against the side of his coffee cup, the sound joining the low hum of conversation around him. The man's voice broke through the quiet again. "You know, people like you shouldn't be here. Should have kept walking. People like you don't need to be inside a place like this. This is a place for people who know how to do business, not people who can barely keep themselves afloat." Daniel's chest tightened again. The comment wasn't aimed directly at him, but it felt personal. Every word from this stranger felt like an accusation, a reminder that even in the years that Daniel had climbed to the top of the corporate ladder, there would always be people like him, people who couldn't understand how far he'd come. Daniel's fingers tightened around the handle of his coffee cup, but he took a deep breath before speaking. His voice was soft but steady as he turned toward the man, who had been too busy stirring his coffee to notice. "I'm not sure I follow," Daniel said. "Could you explain what you mean?" The man looked up, blinking, as if the words had come out of nowhere. His gaze sharpened as he sized up Daniel, his eyes narrowing with mild suspicion. "You know exactly what I mean. People like you don't belong here. You'd be better off somewhere else." Daniel's smile was small, a thin curve of politeness. He didn't take offense. He didn't need to. He had heard it all before. His entire life had been shaped by the prejudices and assumptions of people who couldn't see beyond the surface. "But here I am," Daniel said simply, his voice even. The man looked at him for a moment longer, his expression flitting between confusion and something else. Something Daniel recognized as disbelief. He had no intention of engaging in a debate that could stretch too long. Instead, he left the man's words hanging between them, like a brittle thread waiting to snap. "I'm sorry, I have to go," Daniel said, setting his cup down on the table and standing up. He paid for his coffee, his movement unhurried, his calm demeanor radiating an almost otherworldly sense of control. Rachel waved goodbye as Daniel walked toward the door. He paused just for a moment, his eyes flickering to the street outside. The world beyond the diner was full of possibilities, and soon, Daniel would have to face the fact that even those who didn't understand him, who dismissed him, even here in this tiny diner, would have to reckon with the truth. As he stepped out into the cool morning air, Daniel's thoughts began to shift. The journey ahead wasn't just about proving something to others, it was about proving something to himself. As Daniel stepped out of the cafe, the crisp morning air hit him like a slap, pulling his thoughts from the conversation he'd just left behind. He slid his hands into his jacket pockets, his pace measured, each step steady, as he moved toward the car parked at the curb. His mind wandered over the conversation with the man at the diner, the same assumptions he had heard too many times before. But today, something about it stung just a little more. Maybe it was because, in his mind, He was ready to move past these moments, but life had a way of keeping those lessons close, reminding him that the road to real change was still too long. Daniel slid into the driver's seat, the leather of the car seat cool against his skin. He had appointments scheduled across the city today, meetings with investors, a conference call with engineers in Europe, and a site visit to a wind farm they were constructing in Montana. Yet, his thoughts kept circling back to that conversation. The judgment, the assumptions. The man had looked right past him, not seeing the years of struggle, the work that had gone into building an empire from nothing. He started the car, the engine purring to life. The drive through the city was smooth, the quiet hum of the vehicle giving him space to think. But as he neared the downtown district, where his office was located, something caught his eye. Two police officers were talking to a young black man, his hands raised in the air. The man was tall, his face hardened from the weight of years spent navigating the world, with the same quiet resilience Daniel had learned to master. Yet, in the officer's eyes, he was just another black man, just another potential threat. Daniel slowed the car, his gaze shifting to the scene unfolding on the corner of the street. The officers were speaking harshly to the man, gesturing for him to turn around as they pulled at his jacket sleeve. The young man's face tightened in frustration, but he complied, lowering his hands slowly and raising his shoulders in a defensive posture. It was a sight Daniel knew all too well. He had been that young man. He had felt the sting of unwarranted suspicion, the weight of being judged not by his actions, but by his skin. With a sigh, Daniel made a decision. He parked the car further down the block, his fingers tightening around the steering wheel as he exited the vehicle and made his way toward the officers. It wasn't the first time he had stepped into a situation like this, but this time, something felt different. There was an urgency in the air, a tension that made his heart beat faster than usual. "Excuse me, officers," Daniel said, his voice calm but firm as he approached them. He was already used to the way people reacted to his presence, how their assumptions immediately shifted when they saw the way he carried himself. Today, though, he wasn't sure whether it was the weight of his reputation or the growing frustration with the constant reminders of injustice that led him to speak up. One of the officers, a man in his 40s with a crew cut and broad shoulders, turned toward him, narrowing his eyes. "Can I help you, sir?" he asked, his tone clipped, a clear dismissal of Daniel's attempt to intervene. "I'm just wondering what's going on here," Daniel said, his gaze flicking from the young man to the officers. "It doesn't look like he's doing anything wrong." The second officer, a woman with a tight ponytail and a hard edge to her features, looked Daniel up and down as if assessing him. Her eyes lingered on his attire, simple but well-tailored, and then moved up to his face, where a subtle shift in her expression suggested something was off. "He's got an attitude problem," the female officer said with a shrug. "He's not cooperating, just a routine stop." Daniel couldn't hide the frustration in his voice. "A routine stop for what? You've got him standing there with his hands raised for no reason." The young man's eyes flicked toward Daniel for a brief moment, his lips pressed into a tight line. It was a look Daniel knew too well, the silent recognition of someone who had lived through this, who had learned to expect it, even when it was completely unjust. "He's making this harder than it needs to be," the male officer said, a clear insinuation in his voice. "I'm just doing my job." Daniel's internal conflict began to swell. He had seen this moment hundreds of times, witnessed the exact same microaggressions play out, but it was different now. His wealth, his position, they meant nothing in this moment. All they saw was a black man speaking up, as if that alone made him part of the problem. His jaw clenched, the urge to say something biting at him. But he didn't. He couldn't. He had learned over the years how to stay composed, how to navigate the system in a way that didn't put him at odds with it. "Please, just let him go," Daniel said, his voice even, though inside, his anger simmered. The officers exchanged glances. They were used to people backing down, people deferring to their authority, but Daniel wasn't backing down. He held their gaze firmly, his posture nonchalant, yet the tension in the air was palpable. "You don't understand, sir," the female officer said, her voice suddenly tinged with annoyance. "We've been called to deal with this. It's our job." "I understand perfectly," Daniel said, stepping closer to the young man. "But your job isn't to intimidate people. Your job is to protect and serve." The silence that followed was thick. The officer stood there, clearly unsure of how to respond to Daniel's quiet authority. The young man, for his part, seemed to relax slightly, his shoulders lowering, as he realized that someone was actually paying attention to what was happening to him. "I'm going to let him go," Daniel said, taking a step back, "but I suggest you take a good long look at why you're treating him this way." The female officer opened her mouth to speak, but before she could, Daniel raised a hand, cutting her off. "I'm not interested in arguing with you," he said, his tone firm but devoid of any anger. "I've seen enough of this, and I'm not going to let it slide this time." With that, Daniel turned his attention back to the young man. "You're free to go," he said, his voice softer now, but no less firm. The man looked at him, surprise flickering across his face, but he didn't hesitate. With a nod, he turned and walked away, his pace slow but purposeful. Daniel watched him leave, before turning back to the officers, his calm demeanor masking the frustration he still felt. "Have a nice day," he said, his voice cool. The officers watched him for a moment, before the male officer grunted in response. "You're lucky we don't have a reason to keep him." Daniel didn't respond. He didn't need to. He could feel the weight of the system pressing down on him, the system that had never fully recognized his worth beyond the assumptions made about his skin. But today, it was enough to simply stand firm. He didn't need to fight every battle. But there were moments, like this one, when his silence wasn't enough, and today, he'd chosen to speak up. As he made his way back to his car, his mind began to race. He had to keep moving, he knew his meetings awaited, and he had responsibilities to fulfill. But the encounter with the officers had shaken something loose inside him. It wasn't the first time he'd witnessed something unjust, and it wouldn't be the last. But for the first time in a long while, he felt a spark of resolve inside him. A desire to do more than simply remain silent. He slipped back into his car, his hands gripping the wheel a little harder than usual. The frustration still lingered, but now it was mixed with a sense of purpose. This wasn't just about one interaction. This was a battle that stretched far beyond the moment in front of him, and he would fight it. Quietly, steadily, with every ounce of determination he had. But for now, he would have to push forward. He had a company to run. He had a vision to realize, and in time, maybe the world would begin to understand what it had been blind to all along. As he pulled away from the curb, the weight of the encounter still on his mind, Daniel knew one thing for certain. Today wasn't just another fight. Today, he had taken a step closer to something greater. And he wasn't about to turn back. Daniel barely registered the hum of the engine as he cruised through the city streets, his mind still reeling from the interaction with the police officers. He had always been aware of the racial dynamics around him, but today, something about it felt different. It wasn't just the officers or the prejudices they carried, it was the overwhelming sense of frustration that was beginning to build within him. He had long learned how to navigate the systemic biases he encountered, but as he drove, the truth became undeniable. No matter how far he rose, some doors would never fully open for him. A call broke his thoughts. The ringing of his phone slicing through the silence of the car. He glanced at the screen. Mitchell, his right-hand man. He hesitated before answering. There was something about Mitchell's tone that made Daniel pause, something urgent yet unspoken. "Daniel!" Mitchell's voice was tight, almost frantic. "We've got a problem." Daniel's grip tightened on the steering wheel. "What's going on?" "There's been a mix-up at the city council meeting," Mitchell continued. "The zoning commission, they're trying to block the development project. They've got people out there protesting. They're saying it's gentrification, pushing the community out." Daniel's jaw clenched. His project had been in the works for years, a development meant to bring jobs, affordable housing, and investment to an underserved neighborhood. He had worked tirelessly, fought for every inch of progress. Now, the same people who'd rejected him years ago were attempting to tear it all down. "I don't understand," Daniel said, his voice low but edged with frustration. "We've worked with community leaders, we've gotten buy-in. Why would they turn on us now?" Mitchell sighed, the sound laced with frustration. "It's bigger than just the project, you know how it is. There's a group of activists pushing against any development that changes the neighborhood. They've got the mayor's ear, and the council's starting to listen." Daniel could feel the heat rising in his chest. It was the same fight he'd been waging all his life. The assumption that someone like him, someone black, couldn't be trusted to build anything of value, couldn't be allowed to take part in the systems that ran the city he had earned his success, but the system still fought to keep him out, to shut him down at every turn. "I'll be there in 20, Daniel said, his words clipped as he hung up. The decision was already made. He wasn't going to let this go. Not today. As he sped through the streets, weaving through traffic with a practiced ease, he prepared himself for the confrontation ahead. He had dealt with this kind of backlash before, but something about this moment felt like it had the potential to escalate. He couldn't allow it to happen. He had too much at stake. His entire vision for the city was built on this project, and if they successfully blocked it now, it could have devastating repercussions for everything he had worked for. The closer he got to City Hall, the more palpable the tension became. The streets were lined with protesters, signs held high, chanting slogans that rattled in the air. "Gentrification isn't progress. Save our community." Their faces were a mix of anger and defiance, but there was something else there too. Fear. They feared the change that was coming, the change they believed was being forced on them, and who could blame them? They had seen it before. Their communities were being uprooted, priced out, left behind. Daniel parked his car several blocks away, his chest tight as he got out. The City Hall building loomed ahead, its stone steps and grand columns providing an ironic backdrop to the chaos unfolding. He made his way toward the entrance, avoiding the crowd as best he could. There were a few familiar faces in the crowd, activists he had worked with, leaders he had hoped would support the project. Now, they were among those leading the charge against him. Inside, the atmosphere was no better. The council chambers were packed with both the protesters and the officials. The council members sat at the front, their faces a mix of apprehension and political calculation. They were stuck between the community's demands and the promises Daniel had made, promises that had come with jobs, investment, and a chance at revitalizing a struggling neighborhood. But now, with the media's cameras rolling, the pressure to make the right decision was mounting. Mitchell was waiting for him near the back of the room, his face pale and tense. Daniel could see the uncertainty in his eyes, the same frustration he had felt earlier. "They've got the mayor on their side," Mitchell said quietly, as Daniel approached. "This could go south fast." Daniel took a deep breath. He had spent years navigating this world, building relationships with people who could help push things forward. He wasn't about to let some misguided protesters stop progress, not when so many depended on it. "I'll handle this," Daniel said, his voice steady. "Let's just stick to the plan. I'll talk to them." As the council session started, the head of the council, a stern woman named Linda Garrett, called for order. She wasn't a fan of Daniel. Never had been. There was something about his success that grated against her, something about his quiet confidence that made her uneasy, but she had no choice. The project was too big, the economic promise too lucrative. "Mr. King," she began, her voice formal, "thank you for joining us today. We've heard from both sides of this issue, and it's clear we're at an impasse. I understand you have some thoughts on how to address the concerns raised by the community." Daniel stood at the podium, his gaze sweeping across the room. The protesters were vocal, some shouting from the back, others holding their signs up high. But he didn't let it faze him. He had faced worse than this. He cleared his throat before speaking. "Thank you, Councilwoman Garrett," he said, his voice calm but strong. "I understand the concerns, but I also know that the work we're doing here will benefit this city, especially the communities that need it the most. This isn't about pushing anyone out. This is about creating opportunities, jobs, housing for the people who live here today." The protesters didn't like that. They began to murmur, their voices growing louder. Daniel could feel their eyes on him, each word becoming more of a challenge. He pressed on, undeterred. "I've been here, I've walked through these neighborhoods, I've seen the struggles, and I've seen the potential. And that's why I'm here today. To ensure that we do this right, to bring change that works for everyone." At this point, one of the protesters, someone Daniel recognized, stood up and shouted, "How can we trust you? You're just another wealthy developer trying to come in and change everything. You don't understand us." The words hit Daniel hard. They were a sharp reminder of the prejudice he faced daily. Prejudice that didn't care about his wealth or his title. He could feel the heat rise in his chest, but he stayed composed. I understand, he said softly, his eyes meeting the protesters. I understand what it's like to be overlooked, to be underestimated. I've lived it every day. But this project isn't about me. It's about creating something that lasts, something that helps people like you. The protester sneered and sat back down, but the crowd's reaction was immediate. More voices rose in protest, and Daniel could feel the eyes of the council members shift uneasily. They didn't want to make waves. They didn't want to be the ones responsible for pushing the community too far. Councilwoman Garrett turned to him. Mr. King, we're not sure we can move forward with this project if the community is so divided. Daniel's jaw tightened, and his eyes flicked briefly to Mitchell, who gave him a slight nod. Just a signal to stay the course. He looked back at the councilwoman and took a deep breath. With all due respect, Councilwoman, the community is divided because they haven't had the opportunity to see the full picture. They're afraid of change. I understand that, but I'm not here to force change. I'm here to offer it, with respect and consideration for everyone involved. It wasn't working. He could feel it, the weight of the room turning against him. The protesters' energy was growing, the mayor's absence hanging over the proceedings like a cloud. He had one last shot to make this right. I understand this is difficult, Daniel said, his voice growing firmer. But I've been in this fight for years. I've built this company from nothing. I didn't get here by making promises I couldn't keep. I didn't get here by ignoring the voices of the people who have always been silenced, and I'm not about to back down now. At that moment, Daniel knew the stakes had changed. This wasn't just about business anymore. It was about showing the world what he was capable of, what he had fought for. It was a defining moment, and if he didn't act now, everything he had worked for could unravel. He looked at the councilwoman one last time, his resolve hardening. If we don't do this, if we don't push through, this city will stay stuck stagnant, and that's not the future I'm fighting for. The stage was set. Daniel had spoken, but now the real challenge was ahead. As the tension in the room mounted, he felt the weight of the next decision bearing down on him. It was clear that the system wasn't going to bend easily, and Daniel would have to fight with everything he had. But as the council members began murmuring amongst themselves, Daniel knew this fight wasn't over. Not by a long shot, the city hall chambers were thick with tension. As Daniel stood before the council, the weight of their scrutiny bore down on him. The cold stares and whispered murmurs, reminding him that no matter how hard he tried, the odds were stacked against him. The room was divided. On one side, the protesters, voices shouting out accusations of gentrification, of corporate greed, of the exploitation of a community they believed was already too far gone to be saved. On the other side, the council members, undecided, nervous, as if they feared making the wrong decision. And Daniel, caught in the middle, his heart pounding in his chest, aware that the very future of the project he had worked so hard for hung in the balance. The mayor had yet to arrive, and Daniel knew that his absence wasn't accidental. Mayor Ross had always been a politician first, someone who played both sides of every issue, never fully committing to any cause. If he was absent, it meant he was leaning toward staying neutral, letting the council make the decision without any of his weight behind it. It was a power move, a game Daniel had seen before, but now it was personal. Mr. King, Councilwoman Garrett's voice cut through the room, sharp and deliberate. You've made your case, we've heard the community's concerns, and now we need to take a vote. However, it's clear there are strong emotions on both sides. I want to give you one final opportunity to address the concerns of the protesters before we proceed. Daniel stood taller, his gaze unflinching as he looked out over the council. His hands gripped the edge of the podium, his jaw set. I understand the concerns, I understand the fear. But what I cannot understand is the unwillingness to believe in something better. I'm not here to push anyone out. I'm here to bring people in. To create jobs, affordable housing, an opportunity for the very community that claims to be threatened by this project. He paused, his eyes moving across the room, catching the eyes of those who had stood against him all day. This isn't about me. This isn't about my company. This is about the future. It's about leaving a legacy that can help people, that can lift them up. What are we so afraid of? But as he spoke, the crowd of protesters grew louder. One of them, a man with a thick beard and an angry red face, stood up, yelling at the top of his lungs. You can't just come in here and change everything for your own benefit. This city has been ours long before you showed up with your fancy ideas." The man's words hit hard, echoing in Daniel's mind as he tried to hold his composure. He had heard this before, many times. The assumption that people like him, people who looked like him, didn't belong in spaces of power. But what made this different was that now it wasn't just words. The tension in the room was palpable, a storm on the verge of breaking. He could feel the eyes of the council on him, waiting for him to either fall apart or rise above. Councilwoman Garrett's voice rose above the chaos. "Please, let's keep this civil." But the damage was done. The murmurs grew louder, the protesters more emboldened, and in that moment, Daniel knew the vote was slipping away from him. The council was divided, and if they voted against him now, the city would turn its back on the very change it so desperately needed. The community would stay stuck, mired in poverty, forgotten by a system that never truly saw them. He could feel Mitchell's eyes on him from the back of the room, his loyal ally. But even Mitchell could see that things were about to fall apart. Daniel had one shot, and he needed to make it count. With a deep breath, he straightened, pulling himself together, blocking out the noise. "I didn't come here today to argue with you," he said, his voice calm but commanding. "I came here to do what's right, and I will continue to do what's right, no matter how hard it gets. I'm not afraid of your protests. I'm not afraid of your fear. I'm afraid of a world where we stop trying to make things better, just because it's easier to keep things the same." His words struck a chord, but it wasn't enough. The anger in the room was tangible, thick in the air, and Daniel could feel the mounting frustration from the council members. One of them, a man Daniel had never met before, a newcomer to the council, finally spoke, his voice dripping with skepticism. "We've heard enough from Mr. King. It's time to make a decision. We can't let this continue." His words were dismissive, cutting through the tension like a knife. He motioned toward the protesters, who cheered in agreement. "The project will hurt this community, the people have spoken." Daniel's heart sank. It was happening. The decision was already made, and he hadn't even had the chance to fully explain his side. Just as the council was about to call for the vote, a sudden commotion erupted at the back of the room. The doors flung open, and in walked Officer Daniels, his uniform crisp, his expression hard as he looked at Daniel from across the room. There was no mistaking it. Officer Daniels had been waiting for this moment. The man had a personal vendetta against Daniel, an old grudge that he hadn't been able to bury. Daniel had made the mistake of standing up to him once, and Daniels had made it clear that there would be consequences. The room fell silent as the officer approached, his eyes locked onto Daniel. The air was thick with the growing sense of injustice that Daniel could feel closing in around him. Officer Daniels wasn't just walking into the room, he was walking in to take control of the situation, to add a layer of intimidation that Daniel couldn't afford to ignore. "You," Daniel said, his voice low but clear, his eyes narrowing. "We need to have a word outside now." Daniel's stomach twisted. This wasn't just a random interruption. Officer Daniels had no jurisdiction here. This was a city council meeting. But Daniels was leveraging his power, trying to make a point, trying to remind Daniel that no matter how far he had come, he was still subject to the rules that Daniels and his kind had set in motion. Mitchell stood up in alarm. "Officer Daniels, what's going on? This is a public meeting." Daniels ignored Mitchell, stepping closer to Daniel, the tension palpable. "You can come quietly, or I can escort you. Your choice." The room was in shock, the council members frozen, unsure of what to do. The protesters saw the officer's presence as a victory. They cheered, some of them shouting out insults and taunts. It was a calculated move, meant to discredit Daniel, to break his resolve in front of everyone. Daniel's breath caught in his throat. He had expected resistance, but not like this. Not from someone who was supposed to uphold the law. This wasn't just an attack on his project anymore, it was an attack on him personally. On his very existence in a space that had never truly welcomed him. His mind raced. But Daniel didn't let his anger show. He had learned long ago that anger could be a tool, but only if used strategically. He took a slow, steady breath, his resolve solidifying. He wasn't going to let Daniels get away with this, not here, not now. "I'll go outside," Daniel said calmly, his voice carrying a quiet authority that seemed to freeze the room. "But we're going to do this on my terms. I'm not some criminal you can drag around for sport. I'm here to make a difference. And I won't be silenced." The room went deathly quiet, the weight of Daniel's words hanging in the air. Officer Daniels paused, a flicker of doubt crossing his face. But Daniel didn't back down. He turned to the council. "You want me to leave?" Daniel asked, his eyes scanning each of them. "You want me to walk away from everything I've worked for, everything this city needs? Go ahead, make your decision now." The tension in the room reached a fever pitch. Daniel stood tall, unmoving, as the council deliberated, and the world outside the room seemed to wait with bated breath. The protests outside, the media, the stakes, everything was coming to a head. And now it was up to the council to decide whether they would back down to intimidation or stand up for what was right. But Daniel knew one thing for certain. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Daniel stood tall in the center of the room, the weight of Officer Daniels' presence pressing down on him. His mind raced, but he steadied his breath. The moment of reckoning had arrived. The room was quiet now, but the tension was a living thing, swirling around him, suffocating him with its gravity. Officer Daniels stood across the room, his hands hanging loosely at his sides, his eyes cold and unreadable. Behind him, the protesters were still, their faces a mix of triumph and impatience. The council members sat frozen, too scared to make a move, unwilling to intervene as the standoff escalated. "You don't need to do this, Daniels," Daniel said, his voice carrying authority. "You're making a mistake." The officer smirked, taking a step forward. "I don't need to do this. I think you'll find I'm the one who gets to decide that." Daniel's stomach churned at the unmistakable arrogance in Daniel's voice, but he refused to let his emotions take control. He couldn't afford to let them see him falter. This was bigger than just this room, bigger than just this moment. "You're misusing your power," Daniel said evenly, meeting Daniel's gaze head-on. "You're not just going to intimidate me or silence me because you don't like the way I look or the way I speak. This isn't about me. This is about the future of this city and the people in it." The room seemed to hold its breath, and for a moment, Daniel's expression shifted. There was a flicker of something, resentment maybe, in his eyes, but it quickly passed. He was too practiced, too used to keeping his cards close to his chest. "You really think people like you belong in these rooms, don't you?" Daniel's voice was low, but it was edged with venom. Daniel's pulse quickened, but he didn't flinch. "I belong in every room I'm in." Daniels chuckled, a dark, humorless sound. "That's funny, because last time I checked, people who look like you don't get to make the rules, they're the ones who get the book thrown at them." He took another step forward, and Daniel could feel the weight of his words, the implied threat hanging in the air between them. "And I'm the one who's going to make sure you get a little reminder of that." It was then that Daniel realized what Daniel's true agenda was. It wasn't just the project he was trying to derail. It was him Daniel had known for years, that his rise in the business world hadn't been easy. And now he understood why. There were forces that had always been trying to knock him down. Daniels was just one of many people who had an issue with a black man succeeding on his own terms. But now that realization fueled him, gave him a fire he hadn't felt before. He wouldn't be intimidated, not now, not ever. The council members shifted uncomfortably in their seats. They were either too afraid to act, or too aligned with Daniels to intervene. Either way, it was clear that they were not on his side. His voice, when he spoke next, was calm. But there was a steel edge to it. "If you think that I'm going to let you walk all over me, you've got another thing coming," Daniel said, the words cutting through the room with precision. "This city has been overlooked for too long. People like me, people who fight for this community, people who actually care, are the ones who deserve to lead, not you." Daniel scoffed. "Care?" His voice was thick with mockery. "Don't act like you're doing this out of the goodness of your heart. You're trying to save your own ass. This project isn't about helping anyone but you. Daniel, this is about you lining your pockets while people like me get stuck cleaning up your mess." Daniel's jaw tightened, but he refused to let Daniel's words get under his skin. This wasn't a personal fight anymore. It was a fight for what was right, for the people who had no voice, for the future of the city. "You're wrong," Daniel said. This project is about creating opportunities for the people you say you care about: jobs, education, resources, things that actually matter, but you can't see that because you're too busy keeping people like me in their place. You can't even see the real problem. You're part of it." The officer's face contorted, his eyes narrowing with disgust. He took another step forward, but this time, Daniel didn't step back. He stood his ground, unmoving. "You want to know what the real problem is?" Daniel spat. "It's people like you who think they can just walk in and take control. People who forget their place." His words were harsh, dripping with disdain. Daniel could feel the heat rising in his chest, but he forced himself to remain calm. This was exactly what Daniels wanted, to provoke him, to make him lose his composure. But Daniel wasn't going to let him win. "You don't get to tell me where my place is," Daniel said, his voice sharp. "I've worked too damn hard for too long to let someone like you decide that for me." The officer was now standing directly in front of him, towering over him, but Daniel didn't budge. His hands were steady at his sides, his posture straight. He was prepared for whatever Daniels had in store. "You're a black man in a world that doesn't care about people like you," Daniels said, the words like daggers. "And you'll never be good enough, no matter what you do. You can't hide behind your wealth or your title. You're always going to be one step behind." The words hit Daniel like a slap, a harsh reminder of the truth he had known all along, but this time, it was different. This time, Daniel wasn't going to let the officer, or anyone, dictate his future. He had spent too many years fighting for a place in this world, to let someone like Daniels strip that away from him. "You know what?" Daniel said, his voice steady. "You're right, I will never be good enough for people like you. But that doesn't matter. I don't need your approval. I've built everything I have from nothing, and I'll be damned if I let you or anyone else take that away from me." There was a long, charged silence. Daniel's lips curled into a sneer, but Daniel saw the hesitation there, the flicker of doubt. The officer had underestimated him, just as everyone else had done time and time again. But Daniel had the one thing they didn't: the strength to keep going. At that moment, a figure stepped forward from the crowd. It was Mitchell, his voice shaking but firm. "You're not alone, Daniel. We're with you." The room seemed to shift in that instant. The protesters, though divided, quieted, and the council members exchanged uncertain glances. Mitchell's words carried weight, but more importantly, they carried truth. There were more people in that room who cared about the future of this city than Daniels had ever realized. For the first time that evening, Daniels seemed to waver. His confident stance faltered, and Daniel saw the opportunity. He was no longer just defending himself. He was fighting for everyone who had been overlooked, for the community that had been ignored. "Enough," Daniel said, his voice ringing through the silence. "This fight is bigger than both of us, and I'm not walking away, not now, not ever." But just as he spoke, a hand gripped his arm. Mitchell had moved to stand beside him, his voice low but urgent. "We need to be careful, Daniel. This is getting out of hand." Daniel's gaze snapped to Mitchell, but he saw the truth in his friend's eyes. They had reached the tipping point. The stakes were higher than ever. The council would decide now, but no matter what happened, Daniel had already won something that mattered more. The realization that his voice, his strength, was something no one could take from him. The room held its breath, and the council members stood frozen, unsure of how to proceed. With a sharp intake of breath, Daniels made his move. "You're not in charge here, Daniel," he spat, stepping back with a final defiant glare. Daniel stood tall, unbroken. The decision would come soon. But in that moment, the battle was just beginning. The air in the room crackled with tension as the confrontation reached its boiling point. The council members sat at the long, polished table, their eyes darting between Daniel and Officer Daniels, who stood rigid at the far end of the room. Daniel's pulse throbbed in his temples, but he kept his breath steady, his focus unwavering. "Enough, Daniels," Daniel said, his voice firm but controlled. "You don't get to make the rules here. You don't get to control the outcome because of your own personal biases." Officer Daniels snorted, the derision in his laugh echoing through the room. "You really think you're going to come in here and change anything, don't you?" he sneered. "People like you, people who think they deserve better than what they've been given, are a threat to everything I've worked for." Daniel stepped forward, unwavering, his voice low but powerful. "You've worked to keep people like me down, haven't you? For too long, you've been able to hide behind your badge and your power. But that's over now. You can't silence me anymore. Not now, not ever." There was a heavy silence in the room. Daniel's words hung in the air, the weight of them settling over everyone. The council members, who had been so passive up until this point, shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Officer Daniel's face darkened as he stepped toward Daniel, his gaze cold and hard. "You don't know anything about me," Daniels growled, his voice full of venom. "You have no idea what I've sacrificed to get here, what I've been through. People like you, they don't understand. You think your little charity project will change anything? People like you always think they can fix things without understanding the mess they're stepping into." Daniel's hands clenched at his sides, but he held his ground. This was the moment. This was the culmination of everything he had fought for, the opportunity to take a stand against everything Daniels represented. "You're wrong," Daniel said, his voice steady but laced with an undeniable power. "I understand exactly what I'm stepping into. What I don't understand is why someone like you, with all this power, is so afraid of change. The only thing you've done is perpetuate the system that's held us all back." Daniels took another step closer, and this time, there was a dangerous edge to his movements. "You think you're better than me. You think you've earned your place in this world. You're nothing more than a token, Daniel. Just another black man who thinks he can play with the big boys." The room seemed to tilt, the weight of Daniel's words striking Daniel like a slap. But this time, it didn't make him shrink. It fueled him. It reminded him of everything he had gone through to get to this moment. The rejection, the systemic racism, the constant fight to prove himself in a world that refused to acknowledge his worth. Daniel's eyes narrowed, his voice rising. "You don't get to tell me who I am. I've worked for everything I have, and I've had to fight twice as hard as you ever will. I didn't get here by being a token. I got here because I have something that you'll never have. The courage to stand up for what's right." Officer Daniel's eyes flashed with fury, and for a split second, Daniel thought the officer might strike him. But then, as if realizing that violence wouldn't get him anywhere, Daniel stopped. His expression twisted in disgust. "You're just another fool who thinks he can change the system, newsflash. There is no system that's going to let you win." Daniel's voice grew louder, as if his words were the only thing that could silence Daniel. "People like you, no matter how much you succeed, you'll always be stuck. People like me, we run the system, and I'll make sure you know your place." The room was dead silent now, and Daniel could feel his heart racing. But he was calm. He had to be calm. This wasn't about yelling or fighting. It was about showing the council, who the real threat to the system was. "I already know my place," Daniel said, his voice cutting through the tension. "I've earned everything I have. I didn't get here by kissing the right ass, or by being born into privilege. I fought for this." The council members, who had been sitting back and watching the exchange, finally stirred. Some of them were hesitant, clearly unsure about where the conversation was heading. Others looked at each other, their eyes flickering with uncertainty. They had spent too long in the shadows, playing both sides. But now, they were forced to face the reality that Daniels was no longer the uncontested power in the room. But Daniels wasn't finished. "You think this city will ever accept someone like you? Someone who came from nothing, fighting tooth and nail to get what you've got? You think they'll ever take you seriously?" Daniels spat, his words venomous and laced with contempt. Daniel didn't flinch. "Yes, I do. Because they know that I fight for something bigger than myself. I fight for the future of this city. I fight for people who've been overlooked and discarded by people like you." At this, Daniel's face contorted with rage, and he took another step forward, his fists clenched. Daniel could feel the energy in the room shift. The tension was so thick, it felt like the walls might collapse under its weight. This was the moment. Either Daniel would succeed, or everything he had worked for would be crushed by the likes of Daniels. "You don't scare me," Daniel said quietly, his words carrying a weight of authority. "You don't get to win just because you've spent your life trying to intimidate people. I've faced worse than you. I've survived worse than you, and I'm still standing." For a moment, Daniels's eyes flickered with something else. Fear, maybe, or recognition of the strength that Daniel was projecting. It was brief, almost imperceptible. But Daniel saw it. The officer's posture faltered. The council members were no longer sitting idle, their eyes moving nervously between the two men they had been watching, unsure of how to intervene. But now it was clear. Whoever won this confrontation would decide the future of the city. And Daniel was ready. He had prepared for this moment, knowing that the stakes were higher than just one battle. This was about proving that he, and people like him, could rise above the prejudice and biases that had defined their lives for so long. But Daniels wasn't backing down. He raised his voice one last time, hoping to provoke Daniel into a misstep. "You're nothing but a distraction, a pawn in a game that's already been decided. You think you can change the system? It'll never happen, not as long as people like me hold the cards." The revelation hit Daniel like a thunderclap. Daniels wasn't just trying to hold on to power, he was trying to make it clear that anyone who wasn't like him, a white man with privilege and status, didn't have a place in the future of the city. Daniels was trying to dismantle everything Daniel stood for, everything he had fought to build. "I don't need your permission," Daniel said, his voice steady, unshaken. "The world isn't your playground anymore, and you're about to learn that the hard way." The council members were now shifting in their seats, their discomfort palpable. One of them, a woman named Margaret, finally spoke up, her voice trembling. We need to make a decision," she said, her words tentative but loud enough to break the silence. The room fell into a tense quiet once more, the stakes hanging like a sword over them. This wasn't just about one project anymore. This was about the future of the entire city and who would be in charge. Daniels took a step back, his eyes narrowed with hate. He could feel the walls closing in on him, and for the first time in a long time, he realized he wasn't in control anymore, but he didn't back down. Instead, he made a quiet threat, one that carried more weight than any words could express. "You'll regret this," Daniel said, his voice low and dangerous. "People like you always do." Daniel didn't flinch, his eyes locked on the officer, his body tensed for whatever came next. He had no idea what Daniels would do. He didn't know how far the officer was willing to go to protect his power. But Daniel knew one thing for certain. He was done being afraid. The room was silent, the council members unsure of how to proceed. All eyes were on Daniel now, waiting for him to make the next move. He could feel the weight of their gaze, the pressure mounting, but he held steady. It was his turn to decide. Would he let the past define him? Or would he take this moment and shape the future? He took a slow, deliberate breath, and then, he made his move. The room felt colder now, the tension thick as the echoes of the confrontation slowly dissipated. Officer Daniels stood at the far side of the room, his chest rising and falling with shallow breaths, his face a mask of defiance and bitterness. Daniel, on the other hand, stood firm, his shoulders squared, eyes unwavering, as he watched the room come alive with whispers and murmurs. Margaret, the hesitant council member who had spoken earlier, looked between Daniels and Daniel, her hands trembling slightly as she reached for the papers in front of her. It was clear she was struggling to navigate the storm brewing in the room, but the moment had come. They had no choice but to address the truth. I think it's time we all recognize what's been happening," Margaret said, her voice gaining strength. "The system we've been operating under—" She paused, glancing at Daniels before returning her gaze to the rest of the council. "It's broken, and it's time for a change." There was a ripple of agreement from a few of the council members, and even the most hesitant among them shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Daniels, however, stood motionless, his jaw clenched tight, but his eyes darting nervously. The foundation of his control was crumbling around him, and he knew it. The subtle signs of his power, the long hours, the intimidation, the backroom deals, were no longer enough to protect him. This is treason," Daniels muttered under his breath, his voice low and trembling with fury. "You can't do this." But Daniel knew better. The power had already shifted. It wasn't just the council members who were speaking up now, it was the truth, echoing through every corner of the room. The oppressive air of systemic control had been shattered by the confrontation, and there was no going back. Daniels had underestimated him, he had underestimated the force of justice, the determination to expose the truth. "We have to expose it all," Daniel said, stepping forward, his voice steady and resolute. "Everything. Every corrupt deal. Every act of discrimination has to come to light. This city can't heal until we start tearing down the walls that have been built on lies. A few heads nodded around the room. The council, long silent in the face of Daniel's unchecked authority, was now looking at him as if seeing him for the first time. They weren't just staring at the man who had once wielded his power like a weapon. They were seeing the monster he had become. Margaret was the first to act. She raised her hand, her voice cutting through the silence. "I move that we suspend Officer Daniels from his position immediately. We will conduct a full investigation into his actions, and he will be held accountable for everything he's done." The room seemed to exhale in unison, a collective sigh of relief as the tide began to turn. Some council members hesitated, their faces filled with doubt, but Margaret's proposal held weight. And it was clear. It wasn't just Daniel's job on the line, it was his legacy, his power, everything he had built on the backs of others. "You can't do this," Daniels repeated, his voice growing increasingly frantic as he stepped back, his hands shaking. "You don't know who you're messing with." But it was too late. The council had already made their decision, and the truth was undeniable. "I don't need to know who you are," Daniel said calmly, stepping even closer now. "What I know is who I am, and I'm not afraid of people like you anymore." The council members shifted in their seats, the weight of Daniel's words settling over them. They had spent years living in fear of men like Daniel's, bending to their will, fearing the consequences of speaking out. But now, something had changed. Daniel had brought the truth into the light, and in doing so, he had ignited a spark of courage in each of them. Officer Daniels turned and bolted from the room, his footsteps echoing off the cold walls. It was a swift retreat, but it was too late to save himself now. The door slammed behind him, and for the first time, Daniel felt the weight of the moment lift from his shoulders. The battle wasn't over, but the first major victory had been won. The council erupted into quiet conversations, their voices filled with a mix of awe and disbelief, but in the midst of the chatter, Daniel remained still, his focus locked on the door where Daniels had just exited. This was just the beginning. The fight ahead would be long and difficult, but the course had been set. The change had started. Over the following weeks, the city began to shift. The investigation into Officer Daniels' actions revealed a pattern of corruption that spanned years, one that had held the city's most vulnerable residents in an iron grip. As the details became public, a wave of protests and community meetings sprang up, each one more determined than the last to push for lasting change. Daniel's phone rang non-stop, as people rallied around his cause, asking for his support, his insight, his leadership. It was a fight he had never imagined himself fighting, not like this, but the weight of responsibility rested on his shoulders, and he accepted it. There was still so much work to do. The system wasn't just going to fix itself overnight, but with each new voice joining the chorus for justice, Daniel knew that they were starting to break through the years of silence and indifference. In the heart of the city, near the newly renovated offices of King Innovations, Daniel stood with a group of local leaders, speaking to a crowd of gathered protesters. Their signs read, "Justice for all," and "Accountability now," slogans that echoed the themes of everything Daniel had fought for. As he addressed the crowd, his voice rang out strong and steady, a beacon of hope in the midst of chaos. "We've fought too long in the shadows," Daniel said, his eyes scanning the crowd, his heart swelling with pride. "But now we step into the light. This is our moment, and we will not let it slip away." The crowd erupted in applause, their cheers ringing through the streets, a sound of unity and resistance. And Daniel, despite the trials he had faced, stood taller than he ever had before. He had fought not just for himself, but for every person who had been overlooked, silenced, or dismissed. And now, the city, his city, was finally listening. Months later, as the investigation continued and new reforms were put into place, Daniel stood at the helm of a community meeting that would redefine the future of the city. He had established a task force to address the systemic racism and corruption that had plagued the police department, the city council, and other local institutions. It wasn't just about exposing the past, it was about creating a better future for those who had been left behind. He had become a figurehead, a voice for those who had no voice. But what he had gained was more than just power or influence. He had gained the trust of the community. And that was the foundation he would continue to build on. As he stood in front of a packed room, listening to the diverse group of voices share their stories, he felt a quiet pride wash over him. He had come a long way from that moment in the council room, when Officer Daniels had tried to break him. Daniel had learned something valuable throughout this journey. The true power didn't come from wealth or status. It came from standing firm, speaking the truth, and lifting up others when they needed it most. And it was that power, the power of unity and courage, that would drive the city forward. In the final moments of the meeting, Daniel turned to the group of allies he had built along the way. People who had believed in him from the start, despite the obstacles they faced. There was still so much work to do, so many challenges ahead. But for the first time in a long time, Daniel felt a sense of peace. "We've started something here," he said, his voice calm but filled with determination. "And we're going to keep fighting, because this city belongs to all of us." The applause that followed was louder than he had ever expected, the energy in the room undeniable. And as Daniel looked out over the faces of the crowd, he knew that this was only the beginning. Though the road ahead would be long, Daniel had learned that no matter how difficult the fight, no matter how impossible the odds, he would continue to press forward. Because every fight mattered, every voice counted, and every step taken brought them closer to the justice they had all fought for. And as the meeting drew to a close, Daniel stepped out into the night, the weight of the work ahead, heavy but bearable. This was only the beginning of his journey, but for the first time in his life, he was ready to face whatever came next. The fight wasn't over, but he had come too far to back down now. The city had changed, not just in the way the buildings rose higher, casting longer shadows, but in the way people began to look at each other. The revelations that had swept through the streets, ignited by Daniel's courage and determination, were slowly transforming the very fabric of the community. What had started as an individual struggle against a corrupt system had evolved into something much bigger, a collective movement for change. It wasn't just about one man's journey anymore. It was about the countless voices that had been lifted, the stories that had been told, and the doors that were now being forced open. As Daniel sat on the steps of King Innovations, overlooking the city that had once closed doors in his face, he felt a quiet pride. The work was far from over. The fight he had started against systemic racism and corruption within the city was just the beginning. But his path, filled with obstacles, had also been filled with moments of redemption, both for himself and for the community he had come to represent. He had not always been the man standing on these steps. The memories of his own struggles, the times he had been dismissed, overlooked, or unfairly judged because of his background, were still fresh in his mind. There had been moments when he wondered if it was all worth it. The constant push against a system that seemed so determined to remain in power, to keep people like him and his community locked out. But he had refused to stop. He had refused to accept that there was no space for him in the world he had always dreamed of. Now, as the sun set on the skyline, casting an orange glow over the city, Daniel reflected on how far he had come. The man who had once been forced to play by the rules set by others was now helping to rewrite those rules. Through patience, resilience, and determination, he had risen above the forces that sought to hold him down. But it wasn't just about his own personal victory. As he thought about the community meetings, the protests, and the countless faces that had joined him in demanding change, he realized the greater truth that had been revealed through his journey. Progress was not just about one person standing up against injustice. It was about everyone standing together, using their collective voice to make a difference. It was about lifting up others and building something stronger than the individual. And while the struggle wasn't over, it was undeniable that the people had started to feel empowered. They had learned the power of their own voices. They had learned that when they came together, they could push back against the systems that had oppressed them for far too long. Daniel's victory wasn't just about exposing Officer Daniels or ending the corruption within the police department. It was about the ripple effects it caused throughout the entire city. The moment Daniels was held accountable, the floodgates opened. Other stories were uncovered, truths were revealed, and people found the courage to confront the injustices they had long been subjected to. The investigation that had been initiated in the wake of the confrontation reached deep into the city's political systems, bringing to light a history of unchecked power and corruption. It wasn't just about policing anymore. It was about the way power had been abused across every institution, every business, and every corner of the community. In the months that followed, the city began to change. Laws were amended, practices were overhauled, and conversations were sparked in places that had long been silent. Daniel had made the decision to stay in the city, to help guide the reform from within, to be a part of the solution rather than a bystander. He had been given a platform and a responsibility, and he was determined not to let that slip away. He had faced impossible odds and fought back against a system that had been built on the backs of people like him. But now, he had a chance to build something better, not just for himself, but for everyone who had been left behind. The task ahead wasn't easy. The road to true systemic change was long, and the forces resisting it were powerful, but Daniel knew something now that he hadn't known before. The system could be changed. It wasn't too late to rewrite the rules. It wasn't too late to make the world a more just and equitable place. He had come a long way since that first meeting in the council room, standing up against the corrupt officers and politicians who had held sway over the city for so long. There had been moments when he had felt isolated, outnumbered, and uncertain. But he had learned that resilience was more than just pushing forward. It was about understanding the long game. It was about staying the course, even when the odds seemed insurmountable. Daniel had learned that his strength didn't just lie in his ability to fight, but in his ability to endure, to lead without arrogance, and to keep going when others might have faltered. His victory, however, wasn't just personal. The victory was for the entire community that had risen up with him. Their collective struggle was what had ultimately brought about the change. And while Daniel knew that the work was far from finished, he had seen the potential for transformation, both within the institutions and within the hearts and minds of the people. As he prepared to leave the steps of his office building that evening, Daniel felt a sense of closure, but it was not the kind of closure that signaled the end. No. This closure felt like a pause, a moment of reflection before the next chapter began. And as he stood up, ready to meet the next challenge head-on, he was certain of one thing. Change was inevitable. It was already happening. The implications of his fight extended far beyond just the city he called home. The messages of accountability, transparency, and community that had taken root here would resonate in cities across the country. As more and more people stood up against the systemic issues that plagued their lives, they would see the same truths. That power could be reclaimed by the people, that justice was not a privilege, but a right for all. Daniel's journey had proven that, but he also understood that no change could come without sacrifice. The path forward would not always be smooth. There would be setbacks, there would be moments of doubt, and there would be individuals who tried to undermine the progress made. But Daniel knew that the fight for justice didn't end with one victory. It was a continuous battle that required the persistence and dedication of every single person who stood up for what was right. The city had started to change, but the real work was only beginning. For the people who had joined him in the movement, for those who had risked everything to confront the truth, Daniel knew that the fight for a better tomorrow was the most important thing they could do. It wasn't about defeating one man or toppling one system. It was about staying vigilant, about not forgetting the lessons of the past and using them to shape a brighter future. And with that, Daniel stepped away from the building, the city before him filled with both the weight of the work to come and the knowledge that their collective strength had already begun to move mountains. His mission was clear. He would continue to fight, and he would continue to lead. The world was not perfect, and the struggles of those who had been oppressed for generations were far from over. But if there was anything Daniel had learned, it was this. With resilience, with unity, and with an unwavering commitment to justice, progress was not just possible, it was inevitable. And as long as he had a voice, he would never stop speaking for those who had been silenced. The road ahead would be long, but the journey was far from over.